went out in the hall for something. I know his drum is there, and we were just waiting for him to come in. His wife just went to look for him. Oh, there he is. He's coming in the door now. So when Mr. Green is ready, we shall have him to set the mood for us tonight in a ritual, cultural manner, and we will be underway with the rest of the program. Mr. Green.
I'd like to say peace to everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here another year with the program. And we're supposed to have another brother coming in, but looks like he's not going to get here. So we're just going to do a little, in the African tradition, the drum is what we call to bring the ancestors amongst us, as well as to set the rhythmic tone of how we're going to proceed. So we're just going to give a little short drum rendition and move into the program.
Thank you, Richard. I think that sort of puts us in the mood for what's to come. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Professor Edith Block, and she's going to extend a few words of welcome.
And welcome to the third Melanin Symposium to be held at Medgar Evers College. I have been especially privileged to be the coordinator of these events, and I have had the privilege of seeing the interest in this topic grow to the point where we had, 3 years ago, we had just one single event, and today we have had enough interest to plan a whole day's event. This morning there was a faculty discussion, and then we had a very marvelous children's program this afternoon, and this evening we have a keynote address by Dr. Hunter Adams, who's going to be relating melanin to the neurosystem of our bodies. I want to thank you very much for coming out and hope that you will be supportive of other Melanin events in the future. And you can look forward to a very exciting evening. Thank you.
Okay, next on our program, we're supposed to have remarks by Dr. Edison O. Jackson, who is the president of Medgar Evers College. However, apparently he is either not able to be here with us or just has not arrived as of yet. So we're just going to move right along so as not to delay things. I'm going to ask Dr. Sheila Mayers-Johnson to come forward now. She is the director of our newly established, I guess, honors program, and they have joined the Melanin Committee. She has rather joined the Melanin Committee this year, and as a matter of fact is using that particular topic for her beginning sessions or for the beginning or opening of her program. So she's going to come forward now and just give you a little insight into the honors program.
Good evening, and again, welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to see so many of you here to participate in what we think is rather an important and special event. When I was privileged to take on the responsibility of the honors program this summer, I began to review the materials produced by the honors committee that had convened over the previous academic year. And as I reviewed the projected curriculum, among the aspects of the curriculum was a proposed interdisciplinary seminar. And the intent of that interdisciplinary seminar was to provide a structure whereby a particular theme or problem could be addressed from an interdisciplinary perspective, from the perspective of many disciplines in a related or integrated fashion. And the notion was that the theme would change from semester to semester. So as I began to look at pulling together the resources provided by the honors committee and begin to formulate an honors program, beginning to look at students and so on, one of the issues that I was particularly concerned with, of course, was putting a curriculum together that would be ready for beginning in this spring semester, and particularly deciding on a theme that was appropriate for our first honors seminar. The honors program, as you might appreciate, is designed for students who have demonstrated academic promise, who are high achievers, and who are prepared for a higher level of enrichment academically. And a primary purpose of the honors program is to not only provide an additional level of academic enrichment, but to provide them with the highest level of academic experience that will prepare them well for graduate school. So with that in mind, the entire curriculum was put together. A small group of honors students were screened during this past semester and newly admitted into the honors program for the spring semester. As we thought about, as we examined the possibility of the first interdisciplinary seminar, we tried to get a sense of what would be a valuable point of departure for our first experience. This with a group of highly motivated, high achievers. What would be a good theme to allow an interdisciplinary perspective? And of course, when Melanin occurred to us, it just seemed like the richest possibility. While it emanates from the arena of the natural science as a specific area of study and focus, the melanin molecule impacts on every arena of human functioning because it is so fundamental to our being in ways that go far beyond what we normally assume. You know, for years, many of us assumed that melanin simply had to do with skin pigmentation, having really very little understanding of the importance of melanin in human functioning in general. So it seemed very appropriate to target melanin as an important focus for systematic inquiry for our honors population. And as Bob Johnson mentioned earlier today, this may be the one arena that exists wherein students, highly motivated students, are systematically setting about the task of understanding what melanin is about from the broadest possible perspective. I mention this by way of also indicating that in terms of how that interdisciplinary seminar is structured, I'm team teaching the seminar with Bob Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a member of the Natural Sciences and Math faculty. And I confess to some degree of humility and trepidation as I set about the task of team teaching such an important seminar. Because like many who are taking an interest in and paying attention to, I'm just learning about what this biochemical, biophysical, transphysical phenomenon is all about. But it's an exciting process of discovery and one that is enriched by participating with some of our highest achieving scholars. So with that in mind, it was a useful opportunity to come together with some members of the faculty who over the past few years have set up a Melanin Conference as part of the Black History Month activities. It was a useful merger for us to co-sponsor such an activity. It is particularly exciting to have a speaker who is not only of national repute in terms of the systematic study of melanin, but one who has some exciting theories that I think will stimulate our discussion to begin our interdisciplinary seminar and to enrich the Black History Month experiences. Having said that, again, I welcome you. I must also say I made an effort to prolong my remarks somewhat because I'm aware that among the resources that Hunter Adams uses is an overhead projector, and we've been informed at the last moment that our overhead projector has been put away. So they're making an effort to bring it back, unlock audio-visual, and bring it back and make it available to him. We do not want Professor Adams' presentation short-circuited by any lack of resources. So bear with us if it takes a moment for us to get started. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Iola. Introduce our guest speaker. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Maris Johnson. I was looking for Dr. Robert Johnson because he's to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, and I thought perhaps he had gone out of the room. Anyway, while they're getting the overhead projector back in, why don't I call up Dr. Johnson to present and to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this evening's program. Dr. Robert Johnson.
me also add my welcoming to this evening's activities. I think we started out in a very good mode with Richard Green playing the drums. There are many who say that because there's melanin in the skin and in the body, that sound waves resonate perhaps a bit differently than for those who do not have the melanin. So I suspect that we all felt a special kind of sensation as Richard was doing the drumming. I see that, but I don't have to prolong too long because here comes the overhead. So I'll move right ahead with the introduction. This morning in the faculty roundtable discussion, perhaps one of the things that came out was the fact that we really need to do quite a bit more research before many of the issues regarding melanin are clarified. We're very fortunate this evening that we have as our keynote speaker a person who has made, I would consider, a substantial contribution to the understanding of certain properties of melanin, particularly as melanin relates to energy. Our speaker, Mr. Hunter Adams, is a graduate in biophysics from the University of Chicago. He spent about 10 years working in accelerator research, where he developed an instrument called a proton beam diagnostic. He was also formerly on the staff, the chemistry staff at the University of Chicago. Since 1981, he has been employed with the Argonne National Laboratory. He is doing research, among other things, on biological effects of magnetic fields. He has lectured nationally on biomagnetism, biophysics, cognitive science, neuromelanin, the history and philosophy of science. He has published widely. His articles have appeared in the Journal of African Civilization, Ebony, Encore American, Worldwide News, Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern. He is a co-founder and associate director of Lifeways Science Institute, where he is conducting research in soliton physics, chaos theory, neuroscience, and also developing a multimodal holistic science education program for grades K through 12. He's a member of the National Society of Black Biophysics, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he's also on the board of Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History. He's a poet, a story consultant, and also a consultant to children's films. Most recently, Secret of the Magic Cloth. He's also an associate producer and research director for a Chicago cable television talk show, Inside Issues. Currently, he is in the preparation of several books: Mind Space, Mind Time, Soliton Waves, and the Emergence of Consciousness from Chaotic Brains. Also, he's in preparation is a book, Secrets of African Stargazers, and Coming Forth by Light. You can tell then that our speaker is very broad indeed. And for those who follow the progress on melanin, the moment we hear Hunter Adams, we think of Soliton Waves. So I'm very happy this evening to present Mr. Hunter Adams, who is going to speak to us on the mysteries, myths, and metaphors of melanin, the danger of reducing biology to ideology. Mr. Hunter Adams.
Very much for that very warm introduction to our distinguished participants who have participated in this conference all day. The children, Dr. Myers, Dr. Edith Rock, Dr. Robert Johnson, and their staff. To all of you here, I thank you very much for your patience, and I hope that I will be able to, in the ancient African tradition, speak well, because anytime one is called upon to speak, they are challenged to speak well. That is, not just speak that what one has to say is interesting, but that one has something to say. And I think that I do have something to say concerning the topic, myths, mysteries, myths, and metaphors of melanin, dangers of reducing biology to ideology. The structure of my presentation will be as follows. The first part, I will deal with mysteries of melanin. I will help explain in a small cursory way what is melanin, where is it found in our bodies, and what does it do in those various places. The next thing I will do is talk about metaphors of melanin. That is the psychosociological dimensions of melanin. Also, when you move from more a biological basis, you move into the realm of a discipline known as sociobiology. That is where some researchers seek to find the relationship between social behavior and biology. And if you extend that further to base social behavior on biology, you run into a term called biological determinism. That is, one's behavior is determined by biology. Lastly, I will deal with myths of melanin. When some people take these biological deterministic arguments too far, it leads to the development of an ideology. And we have to be aware of those ideologies. And those ideologies they usually are constructed around issues concerning racial superiority and racial inferiority. I will give examples of each category, and within each category there will be three recurring themes. There will be three recurring themes within each category. First off, that science is not neutral. Second, science is political. Third, science is a cognitive process. From the vantage point of these three themes, I will offer a philosophical paradigm in which not only science but other aspects of life can be ground in to affirm truth, integrity, beauty, harmony, order, justice, and reciprocity. I hope that in some way, I hope in a large way, that I provoke, if not an already occurring critical dialogue, and from what I've learned today that there has been a critical dialogue, particularly at the faculty roundtable, on ethical issues in science, in particular concerning melanin, but in science in a large sense, the critique of the scientific method, and the use of science to explain and politicize social reality. That's what I hope that I will do. Let me begin with a story. Perhaps you may remember the story of the emperor and his fine clothes. Anyone ever heard of that story before? Yeah. Okay. You remember how the townspeople had persuaded themselves how magnificent, how elegantly dressed, how decked out their emperor was in his long flowing white silk robe with gold embroidered threads and so forth, a crown that any ancient king would be envious of. But we also remember that it was the innocence of a child, her natural inclination, or perhaps his, towards truth, towards clarity of inner vision, which showed the citizenry that the emperor was really naked, having knowledge but lacking wisdom, magnanimous in presence but lacking humility, espousing group harmony but constraining freedom for human growth on the individual level. This story instructs us about one of our basic sociological premises. That is, quote, reality is subject to contextual and cultural definition. That reality is subject to contextual and cultural definition. That reality exists within a continuum from subjective experience to objective experience, from the abstract to the concrete. And we must remember that. In any pursuit of knowledge that we find ourselves in, we must see that reality is a continuum, not either or, but it is both. So let me raise three questions. I'm sure most of you already know the answer, but for the benefit of those whose knowledge of history, philosophy, and sociology of science may be limited, let me ask, what are the dominant beliefs of science? What is the proper way to pursue scientific knowledge? Where did these beliefs come from? And who supports them? We all have been taught, from grade school to graduate school, that science is objective, that science is value neutral. We find that in the Western idea of science, first off, what does the word science mean itself? How many of us know, and this is not to embarrass anyone, but what does the word science itself mean? To know. That's partially correct. In the Greek sense, that's the origin of the word, means to know by taking apart. That is, by fragmenting human experience. Rather than looking at experience in its totality, from a holistic perspective, but to fragment human experience, to look at individual parts. And it keeps on going ad infinitum. You have a bifurcation of knowledge, a constant branching off. That's what science is. And we look at it today, we see a profusion of new sub-disciplines, sub-sub-disciplines, sub-sub-sub-sub-disciplines in all areas of knowledge, not just the physical and biological sciences, but in the language arts. Because people are trying to find their own niche. And what we find is that most of those people don't talk to one another. That's true. That's true. Anyone who has been through the system, you'll find that in most cases, an English major won't talk to a physicist, for example, because a physicist don't want to listen, because there's nothing that an English major can tell him about physics. There's nothing that a psychologist can tell a mathematician. There's nothing that a philosopher can tell a computer science. That's the way knowledge is constructed in the Western world, the science research, science education. That is, there's no connections. People don't talk to one another. That if you do, it's felt that you're an interloper, that you're interloping on someone, on my turf. So it gets to be very tribalistic. Really, it does. Very, very tribalistic. And these sub-disciplines, they keep to themselves. They start their own journals so that they can exalt themselves. Because the way the system is set up, it's very difficult to get published in the mainstream or major journals. So that's why people start these sub-journals, these specialty journals, so that they can get their ideas out to their audience. So we have the first fundamental aspect of science in terms of how it's communicated. The most important thing, or in many cases the exclusive thing, is the observed or the experiment. And here you get to the methodological dimension of science research. You're told, we tell children to do a science experiment, and they set it up. That the whole focus is on the experiment. But there's also a person. There's a person that's doing the experiment. There's a person that's doing the observation. There's a person that has to think about what it is that they discovered or observed. And that person has certain values, certain assumptions. But let me come back up to that observed before I move on. I think there's a few more things I want to say about that are very important. And that is that the idea that science is value neutral, because science deals with what? Data. Deals with empirical, verifiable data. And from data, you generate facts. And then from facts, you have information. That is, data that's meaningful. And from that information, you have knowledge. And from knowledge, supposedly, you have wisdom. And each of them are supposed to be a sum. But wisdom is not the sum of knowledge, and knowledge is not the sum of information, and information is not the sum of facts, and facts is not the sum of data. You have to give all those things meaning. Someone has to decide what is a fact, and is the fact truly a fact? Or it might be an artifact. Those are the kinds of decisions that have to be made. And so it's not just the sum, but that's the Western modality. That science, as we're talking about, is the sum of the objective facts from the data that you've taken in. But a lot of the data is excluded. There used to be a time in the electronics and physical world of science that anything that was noisy or was nonlinear was either negligible or you just tossed it out. You didn't even try to solve those kinds of equations. But today, people are realizing that that's the most important aspect of life, of experience, is its inherent nonlinearity. And that's how the whole sciences of complexity and chaos have come into fruition today, because you have computers now that can visualize nonlinearity present in nature. Coming back to the person, the observer, science research is an inter- and intra-personal as well as cultural activity. The person exists within a cultural environment, within the environment of his or her discipline, their peers, and their social group, and their ethnic group. So there's a whole strata of environments that the person exists in, and that person cannot separate themselves out of those environments. There cannot be a dispassionate observer, for example. It is impossible for someone to completely isolate their experience out of their work. They can't do it. Thus, epistemological, ontological, and methodological assumptions and techniques may constrain, confuse, or construct falsely the researcher's vision and produce questionable results. That's what happens time and time and time again. I'm going to share with you some examples of that. Dr. Njeri Jackson, a political scientist and biological ethicist at the College of William and Mary in Richmond, Virginia, has pointed out to us, as have a lot of others, that science has been used to rationalize, justify, defend, and perpetuate systems and relations of oppression. Science has been used to rationalize, justify, defend, and perpetuate systems and relations of oppression. So there is a political dimension to science, and we have to be cognizant of that at all times. We cannot pursue. Someone asked, right now there's a crisis in the workforce, that there's a shortage of scientists and engineers. And so now there's the interest in having racial minorities in this country pursue careers, pursue degrees in college in various fields of science and engineering. But why should I ask my people to consider science as a vocation? Should it just to be so they can become beneficiaries of a larger income? I would think not. I wouldn't do that. Should it be that they can continue to be victims of science? Definitely not that. Should they just become advocates or just functionaries of the whole realm of science? That is, become players within the game, to play the game by the rules that are already established. I couldn't ask anyone to do that. The last choice would be, should they be creative agents for transformation, for change, to bring justice and order and harmony within the fields that they may choose? That's what I would argue that any African American person, or any person in period, should pursue science. From that perspective. From that perspective. Not any of the above. But to transform the experience that we have from an oppressive one, from a life devaluing one, from a life degrading one, from a life destroying one, to a life affirming one, to a life enhancing one, to a life enlivening one. Those are the type of technologies that we should be encouraging our students to pursue, that they should be creative, that they should see all this stuff as tentative, that everything they read in the books is tentative. It's not absolute. It's not the truth. It is a temporary truth based on the knowledge that one has at the moment. Which means that you as an individual can contribute. You can discover something yourself. And if you do, it has to be within a value context that, as I said, affirms life, that affirms beauty, that affirms joy, that affirms happiness. Because anything that we create, those should be the end products, not death and destruction. And when we study our philosophies of life as African people, we'll find that that was the ideal. That was the high ideal, and I'll come back to that. Why is science political? It's not the efficacy of the praxis of science that gives its power, its legitimacy, but it's the political economy that science is in that gives its legitimacy. That's what gives its legitimacy, is the entire power structure, not just because some truths are found out about nature, about human life. Now, what does this mean? When we look at the people who have been the critics of science, they have tended to be on the left. Many of them have been Marxists. Many of them have been cultural nationalists of various ethnic groups, not only just Africans. Many of them have been members of the deep ecology movement or the environmentalist movement. Others have been feminists. But for the most part, the progressive or radical left have been seduced by the very same science they are criticizing. The progressive and radical left have been seduced by the very same science that they are criticizing. Why? Their critiques have been limited by their capacity to posit an alternative view, a more holistic, humanistic view of physical, psychological, as well as social dimensions of life. Because they all have a fatal attraction via their fragmented, false dichotomy engendering, failure-centered epistemologies and ontologies of the Western mythological tradition. Now, what do I mean by the Western mythological tradition? Very few colleges in the United States do not require you to read Greek mythology. Most every college in the United States has a requirement that one reads Greek mythology. Homer, the Iliad, Plato, Aristotle, all those guys. That's where the problem begins, right there. Now, granted, there have been some feminists, such as Ryan Eisler in her book, The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, who attempts to posit, who attempts to search out a pre-Greek tradition where the values of harmony, justice, and so forth were shared amongst Europeans. And she says that occurred in Crete. However, we know from a lot of scholars, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, a whole host of people, that the original inhabitants of Crete were Africans. Now, granted, something happened to them. They probably got pushed out by the invaders from the north and from the west. But that tradition still became a part of the Europeans. It still influenced them profoundly. But something happened along the way, and I can't go into it right now, but something happened along the way such that the Greeks developed a fatalistic vision of life. Let me just share with you one aspect of that. So I think it's important that we really see it for what it is. In an article, and I'm going to talk about this a little later, comparing ideas in Egyptian and Greek thought. Many of you may be aware of the idea or the concept called ma'at. How many of you have heard of the concept ma'at? Okay, most of you have. Okay, it's a very profound principle. When you really get into it, I think you can see that it can be a paradigm that can truly empower us today. I firmly believe that. If we really penetrate into, because I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but you'll find that most of our lives in the past were committed to that principle, even though one didn't know it consciously, because that's the natural way of African people. You see, the whole notion of altruism and compassion, those are natural occurring things that if people don't have any outside stressors in their environment, they will naturally evolve to be altruistic and compassionate. That is a natural neurological fact. There's an article right here from a book called Ethical Questions in Brain and Behavior Problems and Opportunities, called The Neurobiological Origins of Human Values. The neurobiological origin of human values. This is not to reduce values to neurobiology, but to suggest, to point out how that there's in certain environments, certain conditions, lead towards natural altruistic behavior. It's present in other species besides humans. So it's not something that's unique to us. That's what we need to get back to. But in order to do that, we have to know the difference between our way, the Malian way, and their way. I call the oppressive way, or others like Ryan Ashland call the dominator way. We have to know the difference between these value systems. We know that ma'at meant truth, justice, righteousness, reciprocity, and so forth. But the Greeks had a term similar to that called decay. Now, it's different it's similar to ma'at, but it's profoundly different. Because decay doesn't function to create order, to push back chaos. It functions to help maintain the status quo. That's why many of you may run into problems when you have a Euro-American professor and you challenge him or her. You may not get the best grade that you deserve. Because they don't want you to challenge them, that you don't have any right to challenge them, that you don't have anything to offer to them. But a student, out of their innocence, that is, innocence of not knowing the depth of the subject that the professor does, can give that person a very challenging question that will cause the person to really think about what it is that they're asking, to think about an answer. So, and it also says that in this article that decay functions solely to maintain an established status quo with no consideration as to whether it be right or wrong in a moral sense. Now that's entirely different from the concept of ma'at. Entirely different, where it is something that you want to give as order and justice. Not something where you can be either or. None of the African gods act on whim as the Greek gods, that maybe it's this Zeus is this way today, but in another context, he'll wipe you out. Even when you look at the struggles of gods, like Legba, who represents disorder, or the entity that challenges, or Set in Egyptian theology. Disorder doesn't triumph. Eventually there has to be a balance, because that's what our philosophies of life always moved us towards, balance, not either or, but both and. So we have to understand in our pursuit of knowledge that there are some differences, that there are assumptions that we unknowingly bring to our pursuits. And these assumptions can be so powerful that they have us acting in certain ways, responding in certain ways that we don't even know why we're doing it. They have so much power over us. So we have to be aware of our value environment, because life is not objective. Every human being has experiences. And those experiences, those assumptions, he or she brings them to their research, to their science, to their poetry, to their music, or what have you. So we have to be aware of that. And it's only within the last decade that I believe that there's been serious progress or maturation amongst African people, amongst some feminists, amongst some ecologists, to begin to unlearn this dominator type of lifeway system. Because now, with a lot of different methodological and analytical tools, we've been able to deconstruct it, as they would say in philosophy. That is, to break it down, to make it simple. So, I had to give you all of that before I could talk about melanin. Because see, I can't talk about melanin without establishing a context first. And I think anything we do, we have to establish the context. We have to have an operational foundation in order to move on. And so I hope that as we move along, you'll see the value of doing that, of me doing that. Okay, this slide here is interesting because it gives some idea of the dimensionality of melanin and melanin-inspired or melanin and melanin metaphoric research. I'll put it like that. At the top, it's probably difficult to see, but there's a drawing, and you see the head of a figure of a man in a boat. Can everyone see that pretty well? Or not? Okay, you probably can't see the back. But anyway, that's from Alexander Piankov's book, Ramses VI. And there's a whole lot of drawings taken from Ramses VI's tomb. And this is one of them. And this pictures Re, or the creative principle, personified. And if you could see it in its color, you would see that Re, or the personification of the creative process, was depicted as black. Was depicted as black. Now you must understand that if we remember in the 60s, the whole notion of black didn't refer to skin color. It referred to a state of consciousness and commitment to the struggle. It transcended an epidermal description. And that's what it originally meant in Kemet. That is, a person who was a guru ma, who was self-mastered, who had mastered him or herself, who had transcended, reached another state of consciousness, and so forth. That's what black meant. So when you see someone depicted as black, it may not necessarily refer to their skin pigmentation. It was referring to that exalted state of consciousness. And even death was considered an exalted state of consciousness as well. So that leads to a lot of arguments between many different Egyptologists, because on the one hand they'll say, well, black meant death. Well, white also meant death too. But it depends upon the context. Then of course we see the brain there, and that's only to suggest that melanin is throughout our nervous system, but concentrated in the back in our brain stem in a number of different locations. And then we have the molecule itself right here, or a representation of it, but melanin itself is very amorphous, that it changes depending upon the molecular context that it's in, what metals may be part of its structure, and so forth. In the center, we see Osir as the perfect black. That's signifying that, as I said earlier, that the person had reached that exalted state of consciousness, or the great mystery of Aset, or Isis, because she was the one who had to initiate the brother into that exalted state of consciousness. So when you see in Egyptian drawings, for example, you'll see the sky or space represented by a woman, and you see a man representing the earth. Why is that inverted? Because we're accustomed to thinking of the earth as Mother Earth, the Gaia hypothesis that a lot of ecologists are promoting. For the Kamites, it was different. Why? Because space is awesome, and that everyone comes from the darkness of inner space, the inner space of the woman. So therefore, they depicted space or air as a woman to make a correlation between the cosmic womb and the human womb. That's the significance of that. This is a melanocyte here, and it looks a lot like a neuron, a nerve cell. Here, this is talking about different functions of a hormone called melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. That is a hormone that stimulates melanocytes that are these, which are present in our skin, in our inner ear, in our retina, and in other places as well, to produce more melanin, melanocyte stimulating hormone. And it talks about all its many different functions that have been discovered over the past 15 or 20 years, from increasing attention span, for example. Some patients have been given, who have attention deficit disorders, have been given MSH, alpha MSH, that's alpha, beta, gamma, there's different types of melanocyte stimulating hormone, and their attention to detail has increased, for example. This is something that is documented. This is one of the mysteries of melanin, not a metaphor of melanin, not a myth of melanin. You have to make these kinds of distinctions. So MSH has a lot of functions. There's other melanin related hormones, melanin concentrating hormones, hormone that concentrates melanin within the melanocytes. You have melanocyte inhibiting hormone, or a hormone that works in the opposite, that inhibits the production of melanin in the melanocytes. And there's a whole host of them. And they're related to a lot of other hormones. Serotonin and melatonin, for example, which are secreted by the pineal gland. Melatonin is significant because melatonin reaches its peak in concentration around 3 or 4 a.m. And it has a relationship with the dream state, for example, that it sets up certain other, it helps to set up certain other physiological, neurophysiological processes that facilitate your brainstem generating dreams. That is, so your brainstem, where you have this highly dense sets of pigmented neurons, one group known as substantia nigra, that is substantial black, that it is black. I mean, if you look at it, you look at a slice, you see that it's black. And you find that other parts of our brains do have colors to them as well. The locus coeruleus is blue-black, for example. Okay? So these are mysteries of melanin. And I say mystery because none of this is fully understood. None of this is fully understood. So that means if someone wants to pursue it, that, who knows, you may discover something very significant. And towards the conclusion, I'll offer some tracks for those serious-minded students and others to pursue. And here just showing the breakdown, peptide breakdown, amino acid breakdown of MSH, alpha MSH, beta MSH, and another one. shrine of Tutankhamun, and we notice that a star is shooting some light towards the forehead of that mummy-formed figure standing up there. And also you see a serpent doing the same thing. That speaks to the Africans of the Nile Valley understanding of the pineal gland and its relationship to other states of consciousness. And there's lots and lots of textual evidence to support that. There's evidence within the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, for example. There's evidence from a papyrus misnamed Edwin C. Smith papyrus, which talks about the neurological knowledge of our ancestors in the Nile Valley. They had named mostly every major part of the brain that they had discovered, that the localization of function, that the left side of the brain controls to a large degree the right side of the body, and vice versa. And this is all written down. This is one of the mysteries of melanin, not myth of melanin, not metaphor of melanin. And I have to make those kinds of distinctions. And you'll see the value of that as we move along. And, well, there's a couple other things here. Here, this is just talking about, this is known as Lorentz attractor, or strange attractor. Strange name, but it speaks to the whole notion of order within disorder. Order is within disorder. That if you can look at a system that seems totally chaotic, like the weather, for example. Like when I left Chicago this morning, the weather was completely chaotic. It was snowing. There was 5 inches of snow on the ground. Airport runways were closed down. They had to de-ice the planes. I sat on the runway for about 3 hours, waiting to get to y'all tonight. So it was chaotic. But once we got up around 33,000 feet, there was order because we were above the clouds. And I could see the beautiful blue sky. And the clouds, the snow, became an ocean that I was sailing across. So if there's order within disorder, and that's what this speaks to, that when you can look at a system with the right computational tool, you can discover that order within disorder. And so this is leading to another system of mathematics. Actually, it's leading back to our old system of mathematics, where you looked at patterns in nature, patterns in behavior, and so forth and so on, and you tried to generalize about those patterns because those patterns can inform you about other patterns and other dimensions of one's experience. And so that's what we're coming back to. We're getting back to ourselves. Western science is moving us back to ourselves by default because they're finding that this is the natural way to be. So we just have to accelerate that process ourselves to get back to ourselves. So the signs are all out there. We just have to be aware of them and make use of them. We just be a little bit more specific. Special properties of melanin. I'm going to run through these quite quickly. Occurs as granules in melanosomes or organelles. It's amorphous, it's a two-section polymer, converts energy from photons to electrons into phonons. Phonons is just vibrational energy, that all molecules are vibrating or in a constant state of vibration or motion, that if it has to move, it can't be still. There's nothing that's still. It can be paramagnetic or super paramagnetic. That means it has a capacity for to affect it. Very little energy to affect the melanin molecule. Chemical aspects of melanin is very, very stable. It's almost impossible to know the structure of melanin without destroying it in the process because it's extraordinarily stable. And that to me sort of is a metaphor that I talk about the solitary state as something that's being very, very stable, that maintains its form in many different situations. Possesses exceptional oxidation reduction properties, highly reactive under certain circumstances, exhibits extraordinary binding energy, has an affinity for many different metals, iron, zinc, cadmium, heavy metals like lead, and so forth. And that's led to a number of hypotheses of why black people are more affected by lead poisoning and paints in the air from car emissions than Europeans, because the melanin in our bodies has an affinity for these metals, and therefore it stays in our bodies longer, thus contributing to causing problems. And there's some evidence to that effect. But it's something that needs a lot more work done on. A lot of these things, you know, one person did a study a few years ago and nobody has followed up on it. And so these are things that we should be pursuing. So it can even protect cells even after partial destruction. That even when you break it apart, it still can protect cells. And the last part here just talks about its optical spectrum is nearly constant, that it absorbs light almost evenly from ultraviolet almost to infrared. And it can exhibit ultra-weak chemical or photo-induced chemical luminescence. That simply means that it can sort of glow. Light can be measured coming from it, okay, because it acts as a photon trap that your hair takes photons from this room or the sun, anywhere, and it's trapped in your hair, and it'll either spiral around the different polypeptides in your hair, reaching the scalp, stimulating your scalp, and so forth. But sometimes with straight hair, it doesn't do that. That's not to suggest for anyone not to straighten their hair, or that's not a critique of anyone's hair. I'm just talking about properties of melanin now, mysteries of melanin. Some of the most important aspects of melanin has to do with melanin in the nervous system back here. And it does a number of things, affects the firing frequency of neurons, stores energy depending upon a certain environment where those neuromelanin nerve cells are at. And it's also involved in extrapyramidal muscular activity. That is, we have nerve cells called pyramidal cells, which sort of look like little pyramids, the way their morphology is. And most of them are concerned with muscle activity. And so neuromelanin interacts with those nerve cells. And just so you can see where it's found, this is just to show in the brain that it's throughout our entire brains for the most part, but most critically here in the brainstem. Very critically here in the brainstem. Without a brainstem, you really can't even exist at all. I mean, you won't even really be, you'll barely be a vegetable without a brainstem. You have to have that. So it's very crucial. I mean, there's documented evidence of persons that only have a brain stem and their entire skull is just filled with polypeptides, neuropeptides, and they are conscious, functioning persons. So it's still possible to be a person, that is, have cognizance of yourself with no cerebral hemispheres at all, with no motor cortex at all, with no cerebrum at all. And that's fantastic. But that speaks to the significance, the importance of the brainstem. So that's something that people need to look more into, particularly the reticular activating system, and so forth. So there's not a lot of work being done in that area. So that's an area for folks to pursue. Just so you can see that the exogenesis of neuromelanin, that is its developmental cycle, where it starts, where it develops. Earliest observance is in the locus coeruleus, and then 3 to 5 years is present in brainstem nuclei, and around between 12 and 15 it peaks and appears in other brain sites, the frontal cortex, cerebrum, and so forth. But then there's a very slow age-related increase in the locus coeruleus and other parts. These are Latin terms for different parts of the brain. But there's also a pathology to neuromelanin, either an excess or a deficit. See, we're still talking about mysteries now. There can be certain pathologies on the in the decrease of neuromelanin. That's generally associated with Parkinson's disease. And see, this speaks to the fact that neuromelanin is very important in motor coordination. A person with Parkinson's disease doesn't have defined articulation with their muscles. You find them shaking. You see them shaking. That means that fine articulation or control over muscles, the relaxation and the tension on muscles is difficult to control. It's difficult to control because you have to rapidly see our bodies are magnificent. That's why African people love life, because they saw life as the highest principle, because the human body, life as a whole, is a mystery. That there is a fast recycling of these different polypeptides, neurotransmitters, and so forth, that has to occur to relax and tense muscles in a coordinated fashion. Neuromelanin participates in the processing of these various neurotransmitters and other chemicals secreted by other nerve cells. Is that making it too complex? You understand what I'm saying? That the neuromelanin, because of its inherent properties, can reprocess excess chemicals very fast and break them down. So when you have less of it, when you have less neuromelanin present, that means you can't do that as rapidly, which means that your motor movements are jerky. Now some folks say that's why most white folks can't dance. Because they have a deficit, they have less neuromelanin. And I'm going to share with you a leading psychologist at Harvard makes that. So this is not Hunter Adams saying that. This is what other people are saying. I want to make that clear, so someone don't go back and quote me that said that. So that's what a decrease in neuromelanin does. An increase is associated with schizophrenia. And so that ends up being a label on people of color that they're all schizophrenic. get into the metaphors of melanin. I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. Why did I break everything down into mysteries, myths, and metaphors of melanin? Because our lives are very complex, that we have to be wary when someone tries to reduce the totality of human experience, of the human person, down to any one single thing. That our entire existence, in and of itself, is dependent upon that one single factor. There are no one single factors in the world in which we live. We live in a very cooperative world where where we interact with everything in our environment. This has been going on since before the beginning. Not just the beginning of human beings, but before the beginning of life even. That we are constantly interacting. Our heritage goes back to the stars. And see, that's why in Kemet, they said when you die, you become a star again. You go back to where you came from. So, I mean, this only suggests that when we look here at number one, our daily experience, we find that our daily experience is influenced all the way down here by our nervous system. We find that our daily experience is influenced by the organization that our bodies exist in, that the state that we exist in, our daily experience, what we eat, what we look at on television, what we read, all of these things interact on our daily experience. And our nervous system is part of our daily experience. They interact within our nervous system, not on a psychological level, on a mental level, because see, we have that takes us back to the Western ideas of separate minds and separate bodies, that our minds operate by one set of rules and our bodies operate by another set of rules. How many people believe that? That's good. Didn't fall for that one. But that's common sense. That's common sense. So where did the Greeks go wrong? We need to find out where did they go wrong, to point out to white folks, look, y'all went wrong right at this point. See, when Aristotle and all those guys, Pythagoras, came to Kemet, they missed some things. Even though they stayed there for 10, 20, 30 years, they missed some things. They didn't stay long enough, as someone said. But I think if they would have stayed longer, they would have been even more confused. Because they're still confused today. And they have the benefit of our wisdom today. And they're still confused. Or they consciously reject the truth that would set them free. So this is only to give you a graphic idea of the complexity of our life and why we can't reduce life down to any one thing. So there's interaction with language. You know, they used to say that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's a lie. That is a total lie. Words are very powerful. You know, you can get into fights by saying the wrong thing. You talk about a brother's mother, and you'll get into a fight. So words can hurt, or they can bring hurt. So that's a lie. But language is embedded within our entire bodies. When you speak, your entire body resonates and vibrates. So we have to be conscious of what we speak. That's why I would say that you would speak well, speak right, and not take up the language habits of aliens or foreigners, because that affects our consciousness, one's individual consciousness state, how you use language. And many of you may disagree with that. Some folks may like two-lion crew, for example. Some folks, such as Henry Louis Gates, defended them, said they had a right to say what they said. But I asked the question. I don't believe in relative ethics, relative morality that many people believe, because I think there's some standards that all of us have to adhere to. I just asked the question, does their music create beauty? Does it create harmony? Does it empower women? Now, if someone can answer that in the affirmative, then I would support Two Live Crew. But in honesty, we can't do that. So language is very important. Language is something that influences behavior for generations to come, because people pick up the language patterns. And many times, language patterns can become phylogenetic, passed on to succeeding generations. So this is only to suggest how the complexity in the human social, cognitive, and even spiritual environment is, how complex it is. I'll share this with you. And it's important that I do this so you can see how confused things are. When you take any philosophy or psychology class, all of them are based on some idea of behavior and mentation. That is, what's the relationship between behavior and our minds, or between bodies and minds? And we see that there's a whole host of them. Mario Bunge has 10 of them here. The philosophies of mind. Then each philosophy has an explanation of behavior. Then each philosophy of mind has an explanation of how you think, of mentation. And you have to be aware of these. Those of you who are students who have to take all this stuff, you got to know what it is you're studying. You got to know, you have to critically know what philosophy the professor is coming out of, because he or she is going to come out of that experience. They may tell you that Africans are animists, and they believe that the spirit in the tree, the spirit in the rock, the spirit in the water controls their lives, which is totally false. You can't equate African spirituality in the context of European linguistic semantic terms. You can't do that. When you do violence to the whole notion of African spirituality. So I'm not going to go into any of all these, except to say that you can reduce them down to 3 primary metaphysical perspectives. And all of these 3, one of these 3 are going to be the ones that you will encounter in your pursuits. Either materialistic monism, that is, matter giving rise to mind; dualism, matter plus mind, or mind and matter separate things; transcendental monism, or mind giving rise to matter. And that's what a lot of the New Age people are moving on right now, that mind gives rise to matter. But we find on the continent, particularly in Kemet, that you had a different perspective altogether from these, entirely different from these. And it's important that we know what other systems of thought are, so we can know what our own is. Because we can never get back to ourselves if we don't know how to find ourselves. We have to unlearn these other constructs that are embedded within our nervous system. That's a challenge. Now, some will say, who are learning the classics, that they have value in and of themselves. Well, they do, but they will not empower us. They will not give life to us. And that's where I make a distinction. I say, yes, you can study all the Greek philosophers. I think you should know that they exist. about them than we know about ourselves. I don't think anyone in this room can honestly admit that they truly know more about themselves than they know about another culture. So we have to unlearn the life ways of the European, or to be more correct, the Euro-African. To be more correct. Well, we can talk about, just quickly, one thing we have to deal with is language. And that is, we have to be aware of the language of the oppressor or dominator, or language from a Maadian perspective, or as Ryan Esler talks about, a partnership model, where we see what our societies are based on: fear, win, lose, power over, male dominance, generally white male dominance, but in many of our families we have male dominance as well, we have to be honest. Sadomasochism, control, ranking, one-sided benefit, manipulation, destruction, hoarding, codependency, negative conditioning, violence against others, alienation, war, you know about that right now, secrecy, coercion, indoctrination, conquest of nature, and conformity. But our way is everything on my left, the left. Because remember, in Kemet, you always saw the pharaohs or the queens with their left foot forward, because that's talking about the right side of the brain. You have to be balanced. So we have to begin to unlearn this stuff, because we won't be able to do that if we don't do that. Then we can fall victim to the myths and metaphors, not only of melanin, but of everything. And I'm going to share with you some examples in a few minutes of that. Some would suggest that we keep politics out of education, out of all our experience. But that's not possible. As I said earlier, that the observer has certain values, ideas, assumptions, and so forth and so on. So no endeavor is truly politically neutral. It cannot be. Someone has to make decisions about money. Is your work worthy of being funded? Someone decides that. That's a political decision. So politics is part of everything. And we have to be aware of that. And so that brings me to the myths of melanin. This is the some recent articles that appeared in some journals recently. Skin color and blood pressure, genetics or environment. Skin color and blood pressure, genetics or environment. This was an article that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, February 6, 1991. The article itself, this was an editorial, it says up there, of the article. The association of skin color with blood pressure in U.S. blacks with low socioeconomic status. The association with skin color with blood pressure in U.S. blacks with low socioeconomic status. Here's the article, here, a copy of it. New York Times did a short article last Wednesday Wednesday of last week, hypertension among blacks tied to bias, poverty, and diet. Now, this is very interesting because that's the last paragraph of this paper that talks about hypertension is tied to bias, poverty, and diet. The whole paper posits the idea that hypertension is directly related to skin color. Hypertension is directly related to skin color. That is, the darker you are, the more West African genes you have, therefore the more susceptible you are to having hypertension, exclusive of environment, socioeconomic status, and so forth. And the lighter you are, that means that you have more European genes in your bodies, therefore they have less hypertension, so you do as well. Now that's what this paper that appears in the Journal of the American Medical Association talks about. Well-respected medical journal. That's what they're talking about. Now, there's a number of problems with this paper. And we have to be able to read, critically read, this research. If we want to pursue melanin research, then we have to be able to critically read and analyze the work that's out here. We can't just get on the bandwagon of something that sounds good. Now, there's a lot of problems with this. First off, there's methodological flaws. The person took 457 samples from 3 locations: Savannah, Georgia, Hagerstown, Maryland, and Pueblo, Colorado. So this sample wasn't geodemographically diverse. That's one of the first flaws, with just those 3 places. Not so much the number, but the 3 places. Skin color only. He didn't talk about eye color. Didn't talk about eye color as a possible indicator of neuromelanin brain. Didn't talk about skin color whites, that all Europeans aren't all white, right? They have variations of skin color too, but he didn't talk about them in this article. He didn't make a comparison of them in this article. But there have been studies on iris pigmentation and information processing that have appeared. But he didn't quote any of these articles. That Jerome Kagan, Department of Psychology, Harvard University, iris pigmentation and behavioral inhibition. Now he studied all Caucasian, all Euro-American children. And he found that children with blue eyes tend to be, particularly the boys, tend to be more inhibited than children with brown eyes, white children that is. And he made a whole lot of hypotheses concerning the relationship between neuromelanin and behavioral inhibition, or shyness, the biological basis of shyness. So he's in the myth of melanin aspect of melanin research, Jerome Kagan at Harvard. But he makes some very interesting hypotheses concerning the relationship between neuromelanin and this behavioral function. But this person did not look at their research. They didn't do a sociological study, for example. He talks about skin reflectance, that they measure the amount of light that's reflected off a certain part of your arm, and that determines the density of melanin. Okay, now there's other biochemical tests that you can do, but that's what they do to determine the density of melanin. But he doesn't give a chart to show what the spread was of his sample. He just says that dark people dark African Americans are more subject to hypertension than light-skinned African Americans. Just a caveat. I said so, so it is what it is. And we'll find a lot of that in science research. There's no gender breakdown. That's another problem. He doesn't talk about the fact that melanin density in the skin varies with season. In the wintertime, we are lighter than we are in the summer because of the angle of the sunlight. Doesn't stimulate melanocytes to produce more melanin. So when did he do this study? Did he do it all at the same time of the year or in different parts of the year? That's another problem. Finally, well, not quite yet, the notion of faulty genes from West Africa. I mean, that's what he says, faulty genes from West Africa. But that has a lot of assumptions, doesn't it? When you say genes from West Africa, all African Americans came from West Africa. But that's not true. That's not true. Africans were brought here from the east coast of Africa as well. That's documented. Africans came from the Congo, from Central Africa, but granted it was a smaller number, but there were some. He talks about the admixture between Africans and Europeans, but he doesn't talk about the whole idea that African people on the continent with no miscegenation come in all shades and hues. So just because one has light skin does not mean you have some European ancestry. That's not devaluing anyone who has that. Many of us do. But it's just to say that Africans inherently, by us being the first people, come in all shades and hues. Naturally. He doesn't talk about that there was relationships between Africans and Indians, for example, here. But he doesn't talk about that in this paper. He doesn't quote any, he doesn't give you any idea that that happened. And the whole notion that good genes come from Anglos. So, but when we start to break this stuff down, we find that it is psychosocial stress, for the most part, of living in an apartheid racist society that's the cause of hypertension.
It's true.
You know, that's the bottom line. It's not skin color. And that's what this editorial is speaking to. And it was a guy from Howard who wrote the editorial, by the way. And so he talks about the whole notion of that he discounted this notion of a Detroit study of something called the John Henry syndrome. Y'all remember John Henry? The folk tale, and maybe he was a real person, that John Henry was a steel driving man. He laid tracks faster than the machine could, but then he died of a heart attack because that was a stressful job. He was under tremendous stress to prove himself. And so many Africans in America under that kind of stress to prove themselves in the society that they can compete with Europeans. And so he quotes one study that talks about the John Henryism syndrome. But he doesn't talk about a study by a guy by the name of Anderson, which I have here, which talks about stress-induced cardiovascular reactivity and hypertension. He doesn't even quote that study. So the guy didn't do his homework. But his paper gets legitimacy by appearing in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And so what does that lead to? It leads to people like currently today, the whole a rebirth of the eugenics movement, Felipe Rushton, and we'll come to him in a minute, psychology professor at Western Ontario University in Canada, Levin over there at City College, Sarek at UC Berkeley, following in the footsteps of Arthur Jensen, to posit notions of eugenics. That's when we start to get into the metaphors of melanin. That is, that's where people will start to equate based on some ludicrous notions. Now this is from the Annals of Eugenics. They changed the name in 1954 to make it more palatable, called the Annals of Human Genetics. But it still is the same thing. And I have an article that speaks to the fact that it's still talking about eugenic ideas, or the whole notion of the biological deterministic ideas of human behavior and intelligence. Now this was an article in this very same issue, volume 1, that talks about new ideas about mind and body. And look what they said. This is the editor of the journal. It says intelligence is related to size of head. Right. The length of head, head breadth, articular height. And it says right up here, very dull, slow intelligent, intelligent, quick intelligent. Now what do those terms mean? What do those terms mean? But we still see the same kinds of ideas in data, in articles today in 1991. This stuff hasn't changed. And we're talking about metaphors of melanin here. Now the guy in this journal was trying to proclaim it being neutral, but the very first article talks about, let me find it here, talks about Jews. Very first article. And this is a British magazine, too. Anyway, I have it here somewhere. But it talks about the intelligence of Polish and Russian Jews, that we don't want them to immigrate into England because they're not very intelligent. And so you have the whole notion of, as he says here, national eugenics, that every nation must have its own eugenics program, and so on. We saw, how Hitler took that. So we must be wary anytime we see, quote, scholarly research that reduces human experience down to one variable. In this case, we're talking about melanin. So we have to be wary anytime we see research like that. We have to critically look at it, no matter who it's done by. In particular, this guy in Felipe Rushton. Now I'm going to share something. I have to share these things with you because I would do a disservice if I didn't. But Felipe Rushton, in an article that he presented